The most inhumane war tactics of every century. Chapter 1. Cruelty. 2,000 years ago, cruelty in war was public. Armies wanted you to see it. A road lined with bodies, a city starving behind its own walls, a village burned so the next village would understand the message. Today, war can happen from a chair. A person can look at a target from thousands of miles away and never smell the smoke. So the question isn't whether war became cruel, it's what the cruelty turned into. This video walks through 2,000 years of it, 1 century at a time. And I want you to track a single thing the entire way, the distance between the person who orders the suffering and the person who lives it. Watch what happens to that distance. Fair warning, this is history, and it's heavy. It's supposed to be. Let's get right to the point. We begin our travel on a Roman road. Chapter 2. Before the Common Era, Mass Crucifixion. Before Rome became an empire, it was already one of the most powerful states in the Mediterranean, and like many ancient societies, Rome depended heavily on enslaved labor. Enslaved people worked in homes, fields, mines, and gladiator schools. Some were born into slavery, others had been captured in war and sold like objects. Spartacus was one of them. He was a gladiator, a trained fighter forced to entertain crowds with violence. But around 73 BC, he and a group of other gladiators escaped from a training school in Capua. What started as a breakout became a massive rebellion. Thousands of enslaved people joined him, and for a while, Rome was genuinely afraid. That's the part that matters. Spartacus wasn't just an enemy commander. To Rome, he was a symbol of the entire social order cracking open. In 71 BC, after the Third Servile War, Rome had a problem. Spartacus was dead, or at least presumed dead. His rebellion was crushed. The army of enslaved people that had terrified Rome was finished. The war, by any normal definition, was over. But Rome didn't want victory. Rome wanted a message. Around 6,000 surviving rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, the road from Capua to Rome. Mile after mile, cross after cross, not hidden, not done quietly, placed exactly where travelers, merchants, soldiers, and enslaved people would all be forced to see it. That was the tactic. The execution was also an announcement. This is what happens when the bottom of society tries to stand up. What makes mass crucifixion so inhumane isn't only what it did to the people on the crosses. It was engineered to live inside the minds of everyone who walked past them. Note the distance here, 0. Rome's cruelty was built at arm's length, on purpose, to be witnessed. The next century put down the hammer and picked up a much slower weapon time. Chapter 3, 1st century, the starvation siege. Before this siege, Jerusalem was already a city under enormous pressure. Judea was controlled by Rome, and Roman rule brought taxes, soldiers, political interference, and deep religious tension. To Rome, Judea was one difficult province among many, but to the people living there, Jerusalem wasn't just a city. It was the center of religious life, identity, memory, and resistance. So when rebellion broke out, Rome didn't see it as a small local problem. Rome saw a province challenging imperial control, and Jerusalem became the place where that challenge had to be crushed. In AD 70, the Roman army surrounded Jerusalem during the First Jewish Revolt. From the outside, a siege looks almost calm. Soldiers wait, camps go up, walls are watched. Inside the city, time becomes the weapon. Food disappears first, then order, then dignity. Josephus, our main ancient source, describes famine so severe that people were driven to desperate acts of survival. Ancient writers could be dramatic, and Josephus had his own motives, so you read him carefully. But the basic horror is clear. A starvation siege turns ordinary life against itself. A mother can't feed her child. A neighbor becomes a threat. A loaf of bread becomes worth more than a family heirloom. The Romans didn't need to fight every person in that city. They could let hunger do the work. The army outside could simply wait while the people inside slowly broke. And notice what just changed. The besieger no longer has to watch. The wall does the hiding. Once armies learned to weaponize waiting, the next step was to weaponize the land itself. Chapter 4, 2nd century, scorched earth. The Bar Kokhba revolt didn't come out of nowhere. It happened decades after Rome had already destroyed Jerusalem's temple in AD 70. Jewish life in the region had been shaken badly, and Roman control kept tightening. By the 2nd century, resentment had built up again, and many Jews rallied behind a rebel leader named Simon Bar Kokhba. To his supporters, Bar Kokhba looked like a liberator. To Rome, he looked like a direct threat to imperial order. That matters because Rome wasn't just trying to win a battle here. It was trying to make sure this kind of revolt could not easily happen again. During the Bar Kokhba revolt, from AD 132 to 136, Rome fought one of the most devastating wars in ancient Judea. The exact numbers from ancient sources are debated. Ancient writers loved enormous figures and didn't count the way modern historians do. But the destruction itself wasn't imaginary. Ancient accounts describe large numbers of villages and fortified sites destroyed, communities shattered, land stripped, people killed, displaced, or enslaved. This is the logic of scorched earth. If the enemy needs food, remove the food. If they need shelter, burn the shelter. If they need villages, empty the villages. On a map, it looks simple. A commander points at a region and says, deny them resources. On the ground, it's a family standing where their home used to be, fields with no harvest coming. Resistance that doesn't just lose a battle, it loses the ability to survive the winter. War stops being a clash between armies. It becomes a war against the place. But there was something colder than destroying where people live. The 3rd century figured out you could take the people instead. Chapter 5, 3rd century mass deportation. By the 3rd century, Rome had a rival powerful enough to truly scare it. That rival was the Sasanian Empire, based in Persia. This wasn't a small kingdom on Rome's edge. It was a major imperial power with its own army, culture, religion, cities, and ambitions. Rome and Persia fought again and again over borderlands, trade routes, and prestige. And in that world, capturing a city didn't just mean winning land. It meant gaining people, labor, skills, and leverage. So when Persian armies took Roman cities, the civilians inside weren't just bystanders. They became part of the prize. During the wars between Rome and the Sasanian Empire, King Shapur I captured Roman cities, including major centers like Antioch. And instead of simply looting and leaving, the Sasanians deported large numbers of Roman captives into their own empire. Some were civilians. Some were skilled workers and artisans who could build, farm, and strengthen Persian cities. From the ruler's point of view, practical. Why destroy valuable labor when you can relocate it? From the victim's point of view, the collapse of the entire world. Your city falls, your army loses, then you're marched away from your language, your home, your dead, your gods, your neighbors, everything that made life recognizable. Mass deportation is war with a moving van and a chain. It says you don't just lose the battle, you lose your place in the world. And that's a colder cruelty, because the people taken away could survive physically, while everything that made them who they were was left behind. The 4th century took the 2nd century's weapon and turned it around to aim at an army. Chapter 6, 4th century, scorched earth against an army. The 4th century keeps us on the same Roman-Persian frontier, but now the situation flips. Instead of Persia invading Roman cities, a Roman emperor decides to push deep into Persian territory. Julian wanted a dramatic victory, the kind of campaign that could prove his strength, secure his reputation, and force Persia onto the defensive. But invading deep into enemy land creates one obvious problem. The farther you march, the more your army depends on food, water, roads, animals, and local supplies. And that gives the defender a cruel opportunity. In AD 363, the Roman Emperor Julian marched deep into Sasanian territory. On paper, a bold invasion. But the Persians understood something very simple. An army is only scary while it can eat. So instead of giving Julian the grand battle he wanted, Shapur II's forces avoided a showdown, burned supplies, destroyed crops, and made the land itself hostile. Picture being a Roman soldier in that column. You start out marching with confidence, standards high, armor shining, officers talking about glory. Then the villages are empty, the fields are burned, the food is gone. The enemy never has to beat you in one dramatic battle. Heat, hunger, thirst, and panic can do it gradually. And agricultural destruction never only hurts soldiers. It punishes every farmer, every family, every settlement unlucky enough to live in the strategy's path. The land becomes a weapon, and once that happens, nobody living on it is truly neutral anymore. So far, the walls have mostly held. In the 5th century, they open. Chapter 7, 5th century, the city sack. AD 455, the Vandals enter Rome. Quick correction first, this sack has been exaggerated over time. The word Vandal eventually came to mean pointless destruction, which isn't quite fair to the historical Vandals. This wasn't random smashing by people who got overexcited around statues. It was organized looting. That doesn't make it humane. A city sack is terrifying because it flips civilization upside down in a single day. The walls fail, the gates open, the rules vanish, the rich hide valuables under floors, families crowd into churches, people listen for footsteps outside their doors and pray those footsteps keep moving. The soldier doesn't need to know your name, he just needs to know your house might contain gold, food, cloth, or someone worth a ransom. That's the horror of the sack. It turns a city from a place where people live into a place where people are collected, searched, robbed, and carried away. The buildings remain, the feeling of safety doesn't. And when siege warfare met something invisible, the 6th century got darker still. Chapter 8, 6th century, Plague and Siege. By the 6th century, the Roman world had changed, but siege warfare was still doing what it always does, making civilians pay for walls they didn't build. During Justinian's Gothic wars in Italy, cities were trapped between armies again and again. Procopius, our major source, describes sieges where hunger became unbearable, and disease followed close behind. This is the part of siege warfare that never fits in heroic paintings. Paintings show ladders, shields, men fighting on walls. Most siege suffering happens off to the side, a child coughing in in a crowded room, a family scraping at the last of the grain, a body left too long because nobody has the strength to move it. In a siege, disease becomes an unofficial soldier. No uniform, no side, it just spreads through people packed together with bad water, bad food, and no way out. The army outside controls the gates. Famine and disease control the streets, and by the time the walls finally fall, the city may already be half defeated. Chapter 9, Checkpoint 6 centuries in. Notice the pattern so far. Every tactic you've seen is something you could physically stand in front of. A cross, a wall, a fire, a chain. From here, the cruelty starts becoming ambient. Less an event you survive, more a condition you live inside. Watch the shift. Chapter 10, 7th century, people as spoils. The 7th century is tricky, the sources are thinner, and the wars sprawl across huge regions, so the honest way to frame it isn't one shocking event, it's a pattern. The 7th century was a century of massive change around the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. The Byzantine Empire still controlled parts of the old Roman world, but new Arab Muslim armies were expanding quickly, taking territory from both the Byzantines and the Persians. Borders moved, cities changed hands, old empires weakened, new powers rose. For civilians, that meant the map could change above their heads without warning. A village that belonged to one empire yesterday might belong to another tomorrow, and if an army passed through, ordinary people could be treated less like citizens and more like property that came with the conquest. Across the Arab, Byzantine wars, and other early medieval campaigns, conquest often meant more than a change of rulers. Captured civilians could be enslaved, ransomed, relocated, or absorbed into the victor's economy, and this wasn't unique to one religion or one empire. In this period, across many frontiers, people could become part of the spoils of war. Spoils. The word sounds almost harmless, like coins in a bag. But sometimes, the spoils were people. A village raid didn't only mean burned buildings. It could mean parents separated from children, someone who woke up free going to sleep as property. That's what makes mass enslavement so inhumane. Death is final. Enslavement turns survival itself into a sentence you're alive, but your life no longer belongs to you. The 8th century took that threat and put it on a schedule. Chapter 11, 8th century, frontier terror raids. On the Byzantine frontier, especially Anatolia, repeated raids by Umayyad and later forces became part of life. Armies crossed the border, struck settlements, gathered plunder and captives, and withdrew. From a distance, historians can file that under frontier warfare. Now imagine living there. You don't know if this is the month the riders appear. You don't know if the smoke on the horizon is a neighbor's cooking fire or the beginning of disaster. You keep tools near the door. You keep valuables hidden. You listen a little too carefully when the dogs bark at night. That's the point of terror raiding. It doesn't need to conquer any town permanently. It just has to make normal life impossible. It attacks morale, food, labor, and memory. It teaches people the frontier is never really peaceful, just waiting. The cruelty here is psychological. You may survive this year, but don't ever relax. Not the fear of one battle, fear that becomes part of the calendar. The 9th century put that same fear on the water. Chapter 12, 9th century, Viking slave raids. Time to correct the Viking image. People picture stolen gold cups, church treasure, one very unlucky monk's candle holder. But one of the most valuable things Vikings took was people. During the Viking Age, captives were a major part of raiding and trade. In Ireland and Britain, raids carried away men, women, and children who might be ransomed, put to labor, or sold into slavery. One Irish record from the 9th century describes a raid near Dublin where a great booty of women was carried off. The Viking ship makes it worse. It doesn't need a huge army. It appears at the coast fast and quiet like a knife sliding under a door. By the time help arrives, the ship is gone. The horror isn't only that people were killed. It's that many weren't. They vanished. A family could watch the shoreline empty and know someone they loved was now somewhere beyond the sea. In the 10th century, that fate came for an entire major city at once. Chapter 13, 10th century, the city that became Cargo AD 904, Thessalonica, one of the great cities of the Byzantine Empire. Not a village, not an outpost, rich, important, proud. Then a fleet led by Leo of Tripoli attacked. The city was captured and pillaged. Sources differ on details, and parts of the main account are debated by historians, but the broad event is well established. Thessalonica suffered a devastating sack, and thousands were killed or taken captive. This is the nightmare of every coastal city. The sea is supposed to bring trade. Then one morning, it brings raiders, and ships that arrived carrying warriors leave carrying loot, valuables, and human beings packed into captivity. A living city turned into inventory in a matter of days, because a city isn't just buildings. It's bakers, priests, dock workers, mothers, apprentices, old men in doorways, people who know which street floods after rain. After a sack, all of that gets scattered. The city doesn't just lose wealth, it loses pieces of itself. The 11th century added something new to the sack holy purpose. Chapter 14, 11th Century, Massacre After the Walls Fall. To understand why Jerusalem mattered so much in the 11th century, you have to understand what the First Crusade was. In 1095, Pope Urban II called on Christian warriors in Europe to travel east and fight. The goals were religious, political, and military, all at once aid Eastern Christians, fight Muslim powers, and capture Jerusalem. For the Crusaders, Jerusalem wasn't just another city, it was the Holy City. That made the campaign feel sacred to the people marching toward it, but that is exactly what makes what happened next so dangerous. When people believe violence is holy, they can become very good at excusing it. Jerusalem, 1099. After weeks of siege, the armies of the First Crusade broke into the city. What followed was a massacre of large numbers of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. The exact death toll is debated. Medieval sources often use numbers as emotional weapons, not spreadsheets, but no serious historian denies the basic horror. The city fell, and then the killing spread. Here's what makes a massacre after capture so distinct. During a siege, defenders and civilians can tell themselves one story. If we surrender, if the walls fall, if the battle ends, maybe the worst is over. In Jerusalem, the end of the siege wasn't the end of the terror, it was the beginning of a different kind. The cruelty is the betrayal of expectation. The battle is over, but safety never arrives. The sword keeps moving, and Jerusalem became a symbol of what happens when holy purpose and human violence fuse. People can convince themselves they're doing sacred work, even while turning a city into a graveyard. The 12th century found a colder use for the people who did surrender. Chapter 15, 12th century, Prisoners as Pressure. By the 12th century, the Crusades had become a long struggle for control of cities, ports, roads, and holy places. Acre mattered because it was a major coastal city. Whoever controlled it had access to supplies, ships, reinforcements, and influence. So when Crusader forces besieged Acre, they weren't just fighting over one city. They were fighting over the doorway into the region, and that meant the people trapped inside became part of a much bigger contest. Not just soldiers, not just civilians, but leverage. The Siege of Acre, 1189 to 1191, was one of the defining events of the Third Crusade. It lasted nearly 2 years. Sit with that. 2 years of hunger, disease, filth, negotiation, hope, delay, rumor, men dying, not in one grand charge, but slowly, as camp and city both became machines for suffering. The most chilling part came after Acre surrendered. Thousands of Muslim prisoners were held while Richard the Lionheart and Saladin negotiated terms. When the negotiations stalled, Richard ordered the execution of around 2,700 prisoners. That's the tactic, prisoners as pressure. Human beings as bargaining chips, and when the bargaining failed, the chips were thrown away. This is one of those moments where medieval war becomes brutally simple. A prisoner is valuable as long as he can be traded, ransomed, or used. The moment he becomes inconvenient, his humanity can disappear very quickly. The prisoners had already lost the fight. They were still inside the war. The 13th century scaled that exact logic to an entire map. Chapter 16, 13th century, Fear as a Weapon System. The 13th century belongs to the Mongols, and this one deserves more time, because the Mongols didn't just win battles. They weaponized reputation. The system was terrifyingly effective. A city that surrendered could often be spared, though it might owe tribute, supplies, labor, or soldiers. A city that resisted could face catastrophe. The Mongols understood fear as strategy, not fear as a side effect, fear as the point. Imagine being a ruler inside a walled city. A messenger arrives and tells you another city resisted, and that city is now smoke, bones, and silence. Then the Mongols offer you a choice: open the gates, or become the next story. That's psychological warfare at empire scale. The destruction of resisting cities spread faster than the army itself. Survivors, refugees, and merchants carried the story ahead of the horses. By the time Mongol forces arrived, some cities were already half defeated in their own imagination. Now, the caution medieval sources often inflated death tolls into impossible figures. When you see claims of hundreds of thousands, or over 1 million, dead in a single city, historians treat those numbers carefully, but the pattern of terror was real. Cities like Merv, Nishapur, and later Baghdad became symbols of what resistance could cost. The Mongol tactic was cruel because it turned one city's destruction into another city's decision. You didn't only kill the people in front of you, you made future people surrender by making them picture the same fate. It's war as a rumor, and the rumor says, the walls won't save you. The 14th century found a messenger even faster than rumor. Chapter 17, 14th century, Disease as a Weapon, the Siege of Kaffa, 1346, one of the darkest stories in military history. Kaffa was a Genoese trading city in Crimea. During the siege, the besieging forces were reportedly struck by plague, and according to the account of Gabriele de Musi, plague-infected corpses were launched over the walls into the city, a siege engine, built to throw stones, throwing disease. Now the careful version, because it matters, historians still debate parts of this story. De Musy probably wasn't an eyewitness. Scholars also debate how much, if at all, this specific event contributed to the Black Death's spread into Europe. So the honest framing is, the reported tactic is one of the most famous early accounts of biological warfare, and its wider impact is debated. But the idea alone marks a terrifying shift. The enemy is no longer just the army outside. The enemy is the air inside your own walls. A sword can be blocked, a wall can be repaired, an arrow can miss. Disease moves invisibly, and it doesn't distinguish between soldiers, civilians, children, the elderly, the wounded, or the healthy. Everyone breathes, so everyone becomes reachable. Chapter 18, 15th century. Looting as official policy, Constantinople, 1453. The city had stood for more than 1,000 years as the capital of the Eastern Roman world. By the time the Ottomans arrived, it was weaker, poorer, and far smaller than its ancient glory, but it was still Constantinople. The walls were legendary. The name was legendary. The idea of the city was legendary. Then the walls fell. After the capture, a period of looting was permitted, following common practice of the era. Later accounts describe homes stripped, churches violated, people enslaved, families separated. And here's the disturbing part, this wasn't unusual for the time. Authorized looting wasn't a breakdown of the system, it was the system. A commander could motivate soldiers by promising them the city itself, not just victory, not just pay, the city, its valuables, its people, its private rooms, its sacred spaces. For civilians, that meant the moment the army entered, the line between public war and private life simply ceased to exist. A stranger could walk into your home and treat everything inside it, everyone inside it, as payment. That's what makes authorized looting so inhumane, it turns civilian suffering into a military reward. The 16th century carried that playbook across an ocean. Chapter 19, 16th century, conquest as performance. Before this becomes a story about Cortés, it has to be clear what kind of world he entered. Mexico was not empty land waiting to be conquered. It was full of powerful cities, rival kingdoms, political alliances, old resentments, religious systems, trade networks, and people making their own decisions under extreme pressure. That matters because Cortés did not conquer Mexico alone. He arrived with Spanish soldiers, but he also gained indigenous allies who had their own reasons to fight the Aztec Empire. Some had been enemies of the Mexica for years. Some saw the Spanish as a dangerous opportunity. Some probably thought they were using Cortés as much as Cortés was using them. That's what makes this history more complicated than a simple story of one man showing up and winning. But complication does not make the violence less real. During the Spanish conquest of Mexico, Hernán Cortés and his indigenous allies used violence not only to defeat enemies, but to send messages across a political world they were still trying to understand and manipulate. The clearest example, the Cholula Massacre, 1519, the accounts conflict. Spanish sources claimed Cortés feared an ambush. Indigenous accounts often tell a very different story, but the result was clear. Thousands killed, nobles targeted, and a shockwave sent through the entire region. That shockwave was the point. Conquest isn't only about weapons, it's about belief. If people believe resistance brings total destruction, they negotiate. If rival cities believe the invader is unstoppable, they switch sides. If even a sacred city can be punished, nowhere feels protected. This is conquistador terror. The cruelty isn't just in the killing, it's in the performance. Violence as a demonstration, look what happened here. Now decide what you'll do. In the conquest of Mexico, those demonstrations broke political confidence as effectively as they broke military resistance. The battlefield was one half of the war. The imagination was the other. Chapter 20, Bridge, Colonial War, becomes population destruction. But this is where the video needs to slow down for a second. Because indigenous genocide in the Americas wasn't one tactic in one century. It was a long process made of many tactics stacked on top of each other. There was direct violence, like massacres and public punishments. There was forced labor. There was the destruction of sacred spaces. There were alliances made and broken by European powers. There were diseases that spread ahead of armies and sometimes killed more people than soldiers ever could. And later, there would be removals, starvation policies, boarding schools, and laws designed to break indigenous nations without always needing to call it war. That's what makes this part of history so important. Genocide doesn't always look like one dramatic order. Sometimes it looks like a world being squeezed from every direction. A village loses people to disease, then it loses land, then it loses food, then its children are targeted for assimilation. Then the survivors are told the collapse was inevitable, as if nobody made choices along the way. That's the trick of colonial violence. It can make destruction look like history just happening. But it wasn't just happening. People were making decisions. And by the 17th century, war would show another way to destroy civilians, not by taking the city all at once, but by slowly stripping the countryside bare. Chapter 21, 17th century, living off the land, the 30 Years' War. This is where war stops resembling a battle and starts resembling a weather system. This war began inside the Holy Roman Empire, a huge patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, cities, princes, religions, and rival loyalties in Central Europe. At first, it was tied to conflict between Protestant and Catholic powers. But like many wars, it grew beyond its original cause. Soon, major European states were involved. Armies crossed the same regions again and again. Towns that had nothing to do with the original dispute still had to feed soldiers, house soldiers, fear soldiers, and bury the people soldiers left behind. That context matters because the cruelty here wasn't always one commander ordering one massacre. It was the way the war kept moving through civilian life until normal survival became almost impossible. Armies marched through Central Europe for decades. They needed food, animals, shelter, carts, clothing, firewood, money, and when governments couldn't supply all of it, soldiers took it. The phrase for this was living off the land. It sounds almost peaceful, a man fishing beside a river, eating berries. In reality, it usually meant armed men walking into a village and stripping it bare. Grain, livestock, tools, anything that could keep the army moving. And then the villagers were left with the privilege of starving quietly after the soldiers moved on. The 30 Years' War devastated civilian populations through battle, famine, disease, displacement, and repeated plundering. In many regions, civilians suffered far more than the armies claiming to protect them. That's the cruelty of living off the land. It drafts the civilian economy into the army's supply chain. The farmer becomes the quartermaster against his will. The village becomes a warehouse. And when the warehouse is empty, the army simply moves on. The 18th century wrote its worst idea down in letters we can still read. Chapter 22, 18th century, smallpox, on purpose Pontiac's War, and one of the most infamous, most carefully debated episodes in North American history. But first, the context. By the 18th century, indigenous nations in North America were not simply standing still while European empires fought around them. They were making alliances, defending territory, trading, negotiating, resisting, and trying to survive between rival imperial powers. Pontiac's War came after the French and Indian War, when Britain gained control over former French territory in North America. For many indigenous nations, British rule brought new restrictions, new forts, disrupted trade, and the threat of settlers pushing deeper onto their lands. So this was not just random violence on the frontier, it was a struggle over land, power, survival, and who would control the future of the continent. Smallpox was already devastating indigenous communities. The disease spread with terrifying speed, and indigenous nations had already suffered enormously from epidemics connected to European contact and colonization. But during the conflict around Fort Pitt, British officers discussed and attempted to use smallpox deliberately. The most famous evidence is the Amherst Correspondence, Lord Geoffrey Amherst, asking whether smallpox could be spread among indigenous groups. Around the same period, officers at Fort Pitt gave indigenous representatives items from a smallpox hospital, including blankets and a handkerchief. Historians debate how effective this specific attempt was. Smallpox was already circulating, so you can't claim more certainty than the evidence allows. But the documented intent is horrifying enough on its own. This wasn't disease happening during a war. This was people, in writing, discussing disease as a weapon. And this matters because smallpox wasn't just another weapon in a battlefield toolkit. For many indigenous communities, epidemic disease arrived inside a much larger colonial disaster. Land was being taken, trade systems were being manipulated, food sources were being disrupted, military alliances were being used and abandoned. And when disease hit communities already under pressure, it didn't just kill individuals. It damaged memory, leadership, family structure, and the ability to resist. That's why this can't be treated like a dark trivia fact about blankets. The real horror is bigger than the object. The blanket is memorable because you can picture it, but the deeper story is a colonial world where indigenous life could be treated as an obstacle to be managed, removed, weakened, or erased. Smallpox doesn't distinguish between a warrior, a grandmother, a child, or someone trying to stay out of the conflict entirely. And unlike a bullet, an outbreak doesn't stop when the soldier walks away. The 19th century's entry will surprise people because most viewers think it belongs to the century after. Chapter 23, 19th century, the concentration camp. Concentration camps existed before World War II. The example here is the Second Boer War. The Boers were descendants of Dutch settlers in southern Africa, and by the late 19th century, they controlled two republics, rich in land and resources. Britain wanted power in the region, especially as gold and diamonds made southern Africa even more valuable. When the war became harder to win than Britain expected, Boer fighters turned to guerrilla tactics. They used farms, families, and local support networks to keep resisting, so Britain tried to break the network behind the fighters, and that is where civilians became targets of policy. During the Second Boer War, the British used camps in South Africa to hold Boer civilians, especially women and children, along with separate camps for black Africans. The stated goal was tied to fighting Boer guerrilla resistance. If fighters were being supported by farms, families, and local networks, remove the support system. On paper, that sounds like military logic. In reality, civilians were forced into camps where overcrowding, poor sanitation, disease, inadequate food, and bad administration killed tens of thousands. The cruelty of the concentration camp is bureaucratic. Nobody has to swing a sword. Nobody has to burn a city in an afternoon. People die because the system puts them somewhere they can't survive, and then calls it policy. That's what makes this tactic feel modern. It doesn't look like ancient rage. It looks like paperwork, tents, rations, reports, and excuses. And that's almost worse, because it shows how inhumane war becomes when suffering is organized neatly enough to look administrative. Chapter 24, Checkpoint Before the 20th Century. Stop here for a moment, because everything you've watched so far, the siege, the sack, the camp, the plague, the terror, the paperwork, is about to converge. The 20th century didn't invent new cruelty. It industrialized all of it at once. This is the longest chapter in the video. It has to be. Chapter 25, 20th Century, Industrialized Cruelty. Not because humans suddenly became evil. Humans were already very good at that. But because technology, bureaucracy, chemistry, aircraft, factories, railways, and mass politics handed cruelty new tools. 6 of them. And the reason this century needs more room is that these weren't isolated horrors. They were connected by the same modern machinery. Factories made the weapons. States organized the people. Railways and aircraft moved destruction faster. And bureaucracies made enormous suffering feel like a series of manageable decisions. That is what makes the 20th century different. It didn't invent cruelty, it scaled it. First, poison gas. In World War I, soldiers were already trapped in trenches, mud, rats, barbed wire, artillery, and the constant knowledge that going over the top might be the last thing they ever did. Then came gas. At Second Ypres, in 1915, German forces used chlorine gas at scale. A greenish-yellow cloud rolled across the battlefield, and men trained to dodge bullets suddenly had to fight the air. That's what made gas uniquely terrifying. You didn't only fear what you could see, you feared breathing. Your lungs, the one thing you use every second without thinking, became the place where the war entered. Second, the trenches themselves. Trenches weren't invented in the 20th century, but World War I turned them into a world. Men lived in ditches for months, slept in mud, waited under shell fire, watched tiny strips of land cost thousands of lives. The cruelty here was repetition, not one dramatic death, a system that kept feeding human beings into the same ruined ground again and again, because neither side could break through. War as a meat grinder with a calendar. Third, firebombing and strategic bombing. For all of prior history, destroying a city meant reaching it, marching there, surrounding it, breaking its walls. In the 20th century, cities could be attacked from the sky. Strategic bombing promised to break industry, morale, and the enemy's capacity to fight. In practice, civilians became targets, victims, and pressure points. A city at night is one of the most human things in the world. People cooking, sleeping, reading, putting children to bed, fixing a loose window, assuming tomorrow will come, then the sky opens. Firebombing turned streets into furnaces. It proved modern war could reach people who never held a rifle, never stood on a battlefield, and never had any way to surrender to the pilot above them. Fourth, the atomic bomb. Hiroshima and Nagasaki changed the meaning of the word weapon. For most of history, even terrible weapons had limits you could picture. A sword reaches so far, a cannon hits one place at a time. An atomic bomb made destruction feel almost godlike. One aircraft, one bomb, one city transformed in a flash. And the horror wasn't only the blast. It was the burns, the radiation sickness, the long-term suffering, and the realization that humanity had built a weapon capable of making future wars civilization ending. Before this, war could destroy cities. After this, war could threaten the world. Fifth, the Holocaust. This has to be treated separately because it wasn't a battlefield tactic like a siege or a raid. It was industrialized genocide under Nazi rule and occupation. The Holocaust was the systematic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million European Jews, along with the persecution and murder of millions of other victims by Nazi Germany and its collaborators. What makes it one of the darkest events in human history is not only the scale, it's the organization. Trains, lists, camps, ghettos, bureaucrats, guards, factories, files. The machinery of a modern state turned toward extermination. Ancient cruelty often wanted to be seen. This cruelty could hide behind forms, orders, euphemisms, and office doors. That's one of the most frightening lessons of the 20th century. A massacre can be done by a mob. A genocide can be done by a schedule. Sixth, chemical defoliants and napalm. In Vietnam, the environment itself became part of the war. Agent Orange stripped forests to destroy cover and crops. Napalm burned with an intensity that made it one of the conflict's most infamous symbols. And again, the cruelty outlasts the battlefield, because a forest isn't just trees. It's shade, food, medicine, hiding places, animals, soil, memory, the shape of home. When war attacks the landscape, civilians live with the consequences long after the soldiers leave. That's the 20th century in one terrible pattern. War became more technical, more distant, more organized, more efficient, not more humane. The weapons changed, the excuses got more polished, the maps got cleaner, but underneath all of it, the human body was still the place where every decision landed, which leaves 1 century, ours. Chapter 26, 21st Century Remote Killing. For this century, the strongest choice is drone warfare. Not because every drone strike is automatically illegal or inhumane, that would be too simple, and it wouldn't be accurate. Drones can provide surveillance. They can reduce risk for the side using them. And under international humanitarian law, they're bound by the same rules as any weapon: distinction, proportionality, and precautions to reduce civilian harm. But drones pose a uniquely modern question: what happens when killing becomes distant? And now there's an even newer question: what happens when the machine doesn't just carry the weapon, but helps choose the target? Modern militaries are increasingly interested in artificial intelligence for surveillance, pattern recognition, target identification, and decision support. The sales pitch is simple: faster decisions, more data, fewer mistakes. But war is exactly where faster can become dangerous. Because a battlefield is not a clean spreadsheet. A person carrying a shovel may be digging a trench or repairing a pipe. A truck may be carrying fighters or families. A phone signal may belong to the target, or to someone who borrowed the phone, or to someone standing too close to the wrong person at the wrong time. AI systems work by classification. War crimes often begin with misclassification. And if an AI-assisted system points to a target, a commander approves it, a contractor built the model, an analyst trusted the output, and a drone fires the missile, then the question becomes terrifyingly modern. Who is responsible when the machine helps make the mistake? That's not an abstract fear anymore. In 2026, a strike on the Shajareh Tayyebe Elementary School in Minab, Iran, became one of the clearest modern examples of what accountability looks like when the target is wrong. According to Reuters, U.S. military investigators believed it was likely that U.S. forces were responsible for the strike. Amnesty International later said the strike killed more than 150 people, including 120 children, and called for accountability. Figures vary across sources, from around 156 to over 170 casualties. UN experts also condemned the deadly strike on a girls' school in Iran and called for investigation. This is the kind of event that makes modern war feel almost impossible to morally process, because from far away, a target can look like a coordinate, a compound, a signal, a pattern, a possible threat. But on the ground, it can be a classroom, desks, backpacks, morning noise, children who had no idea that somewhere far away, they might already have been turned into a mistake. And if that mistake came from bad intelligence, rushed review, flawed targeting, political pressure, or a system that made uncertainty look like confidence, then accountability can't stop at the missile. Who had the power to stop it and didn't? U.S. officials confirmed that artificial intelligence was used in the operation, processing intelligence, helping analysts identify targets at a speed no human staff could match. Nearly 2,000 targets in the first 4 days. One of them was this girls' elementary school. The school had been separated from the military compound next door for roughly a decade. The wall was visible in commercial satellite imagery. The school had a website, but the targeting coordinates were built on outdated intelligence that still classified the site as military. And here is where the machine age shows its true shape. The Pentagon's preliminary report says the technology didn't cause the error, a human did. Investigators are still examining what role the AI tools played. Senators are still demanding answers. Months later, the findings still haven't been released. So ask the question this whole timeline has been building toward: who is responsible? The analyst who trusted the data? The system that never flagged it? The officer who approved the strike? The agency that never updated the file? A sword has one hand on it. This strike had 100, and every one of them can point at another. That's the terrifying part of 21st century war. The distance is no longer just physical, it's legal, technical, bureaucratic, algorithmic, and every layer of distance gives someone a place to hide. For most of history, violence required presence. A soldier saw the gate, heard the city, smelled the smoke, felt the fear around him. That never made war moral, but it made war physically immediate. Drone warfare changes that relationship. The operator may see the target clearly, maybe more clearly than a bomber pilot ever could, but they're also separated by screens, sensors, distance, and procedure. War starts to look like footage. A person becomes a shape. A building becomes a coordinate. A strike becomes a clip, reviewed later. That distance can make war feel cleaner than it is. And that may be the most important modern danger. Not that machines make humans cruel, but that machines can make cruelty easier to tolerate. The person suffering is still real. The family is still real. The mistake is still real. The fear underneath the drone is still real. The difference is that the person making the decision may never have to stand in the ruins. Chapter 27. Closing the distance. Remember what I asked you to track at the start, the distance between the person ordering the cruelty and the person living it. Rome built its cruelty at arm's length and made you walk past it for miles. The siege put a wall between the army and the starving. The camp put paperwork between the policy and the dying. The bomber put altitude between the pilot and the city. The drone put an ocean and a screen between the decision and the ruins. 2,000 years, and the suffering never got smaller. It only got farther from the person choosing it. War didn't become less brutal. It became better at changing the distance between the person giving the order and the person living with the result. And if this timeline shows one thing, it's that technology doesn't automatically make war humane. Sometimes it only makes the cruelty more efficient. Sometimes it makes it easier to hide. And sometimes it lets people tell themselves they're being civilized, while someone else is still starving behind the wall, coughing in the trench, burning under the sky, or waiting beneath the sound of a machine they can't reach. The tactics changed every century. The warning stayed the same. When war forgets the humanity of the people inside it, every age finds its own way to become ancient again. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.